September 8, 1900. Galveston, Texas. A Saturday morning. Warm, a little breezy, some clouds on the horizon. People go to the beach because it is a beautiful late summer day, and Galveston has some of the best beaches in Texas. By midnight that night, at least 8 of them are dead. Possibly 12 The exact number is not known, because when a hurricane destroys an entire city without warning, no radar, no satellites, no evacuation order, it is very hard to count the bodies afterward. The Galveston Hurricane of 1900 is the deadliest natural disaster in American history. It still is, more than any earthquake, more than any flood, more than any tornado. One storm, one night, one city, and nobody saw it coming. Not because they were careless, not because they were foolish, because it was 1900. And the tools to see a hurricane coming simply did not exist yet. This is the real story of the Galveston Hurricane. And the ending, which most people do not know, is one of the most extraordinary things an American city has ever done. Let me tell you what Galveston actually was in 1900. Because it was not a small coastal town. Galveston was one of the most important cities in America. It was the 4th busiest port in the United States. Cotton, grain, timber, enormous amounts of American trade moved through Galveston's docks. The city had a population of about 40,000 people. It had electric lights and telephones and streetcars. It had grand Victorian mansions and hotels and churches. It was the largest city in Texas, bigger than Houston. Houston, at that point, was a smaller inland town. Galveston was the prosperous one, the important one, the one with the future. The city sat on a barrier island, a long, thin strip of land in the Gulf of Mexico, separated from the Texas mainland by a bay. It was beautiful. The beaches were famous, the climate was pleasant. There was one obvious vulnerability. The island was barely 2 meters above sea level at its highest point. It sat in the Gulf of Mexico, in a region known for hurricanes. City leaders had discussed building a seawall to protect the island. The idea had been rejected. Too expensive, some said. Not necessary, others said. The city was perfectly safe. They believed that. On September 7th and 8th, the U.S. Weather Bureau was tracking a storm in the Gulf of Mexico. They knew something was out there. They did not know how big it was. Communication was by telegraph in 1900. Weather information moved slowly. Satellite imagery did not exist. Aerial reconnaissance did not exist. The meteorologist in charge of the Galveston weather station was a man named Isaac Klein. Klein was experienced and confident. He had, in fact, written an article in 1891 arguing that a hurricane could never seriously damage Galveston. He believed the geography of the Gulf, the shallow water, the gradual slope of the seafloor approaching the island would naturally weaken any storm before it reached the city. He believed this completely. On the morning of September 8th, Klein noticed the unusual swell in the water. The waves were coming from the wrong direction. The barometric pressure was dropping. He rode his horse along the beach, warning people to move to higher ground. But Klein also sent a telegraph to Washington saying conditions were not threatening, because he still believed his 1891 theory. He was wrong. The storm that was approaching Galveston was a Category 4 hurricane, winds of up to 230 kilometers per hour, a storm surge that would raise the sea level around the island by 4 to 5 meters. On an island that was barely 2 meters above sea level, the storm hit Galveston on the afternoon and evening of September 8th. First the wind, growing through the afternoon from strong to violent to something beyond description. The rain was horizontal. The wind was loud enough to make communication impossible. And then the water, the storm surge. 4 to 5 meters of ocean, pushed by the hurricane over the low barrier island. The water rose in houses, first to ankle height, then knee height, then waist, then chest, then over people's heads. The houses themselves began to go. Galveston's buildings were mostly wood frame construction, beautiful Victorian architecture, but wood, built on a flat island with nowhere for water to drain. When the surge came, the houses were picked up, smashed into each other, turned into debris. And the debris, The broken wood and metal and stone of thousands of buildings was carried by the surge water and used as a battering ram against whatever remained standing. People who survived described clinging to floating debris for hours in total darkness, unable to see anything, unable to hear anything above the wind and water, holding on while things crashed into them from every direction. It was dark, it was loud, it was absolute chaos, and it lasted for hours. The storm passed in the early hours of September 9th. When dawn came, Galveston was almost unrecognizable. About 600 buildings had been destroyed, roughly half the city. The debris, wood, metal, furniture, personal belongings, was piled in enormous drifts across what had been streets, and in that debris were the dead. The city faced an immediate practical nightmare. In September, in Texas, in heat and humidity. The bodies could not stay. In the days after the storm, the city tried to bury bodies at sea. Bodies were taken out on barges and dropped into the Gulf. The Gulf brought many of them back. The city then made the terrible decision to burn the debris. In the wreckage, where it lay. It took weeks. The smell reached the Texas mainland. The death toll estimates range from 8 to 12. The range is so wide because there was no complete census of who was in the city that weekend. Visitors, travelers, people passing through, all counted in the dead without being counted in the living. Galveston lost between 20% and 30% of its population in a single night. In a single night. Into this disaster came a 78-year-old woman named Clara Barton. Clara Barton was the founder of the American Red Cross. She had organized relief in the Civil War. She had worked in disasters across the country for decades. She was 78 years old when the Galveston Hurricane hit. She came anyway. Barton arrived in Galveston 5 days after the storm and spent 5 weeks organizing relief efforts, distributing food, medical supplies, clothing, setting up orphanages for children who had lost their families. She worked alongside the people of Galveston, who themselves showed remarkable organization and resilience in the days after the disaster. Martial law was declared. Citizens were pressed into service-clearing debris. Businesses were commandeered for relief operations. The chaos of the first days gave way, slowly, to the beginning of order. Clara Barton, in her reports from Galveston, noted something that struck her. The people of the city were not waiting to be saved. They were saving themselves and planning something extraordinary. Here's what Galveston decided to do. Other cities, in the aftermath of a disaster of this scale, might have been abandoned. The population might have moved inland permanently. The city might have been written off. Galveston decided to stay, and to do something that had never been done before. They decided to build a seawall, not a small seawall, a massive one, a concrete barrier 2 meters high, higher than the storm surge that had destroyed the city, stretching along the entire Gulf-facing side of the island. And then, and this is the part that is genuinely extraordinary, they decided to raise the entire city behind it. They pumped sand from the Gulf floor and used it to raise the elevation of the land behind the seawall. The entire city. Raised by up to 5 meters. Every building in the raised area was jacked up on temporary supports. The sand was pumped underneath. The building was lowered back down. Over 2,000 buildings were raised this way, including a 3,000-ton cathedral. They raised a cathedral on temporary supports, while people attended services inside. The grade raising of Galveston is one of the greatest engineering achievements in American history. It was done between 1902 and 1910. The process was straightforward in concept and extraordinary in execution. A canal dredge pumped sand and water, called slurry, from the Gulf floor through a network of pipes that covered the entire city. The slurry was deposited on the land, raising it by between 1 and 5 meters depending on location. Before the sand was pumped in, every building in the affected area had to be prepared. Pipes were raised, sewers were rerouted, trees were somehow kept alive while their roots were buried in the rising sand, and the buildings were lifted, on screw jacks, hundreds of screw jacks per building. Workers turning them simultaneously to keep each building level as it rose. The 3,000-ton Cathedral of St. Patrick, the one with services still being held inside, was lifted nearly 2 meters. Imagine being in that church, sitting in a pew, while the whole building slowly rose around you, and you were still expected to be there on Sunday. The grade raising cost about $2 million in 1910, roughly $70 million today. The people of Galveston paid it, because they were staying. Did it work? Yes. In 1915, another major hurricane hit Galveston, comparable in size to the 1900 storm. This time, the seawall held. The storm surge hit the seawall. The seawall redirected it. The city behind it survived. 8 people died in the 1915 storm. 8, compared to 8,000 in 1900. The seawall worked. In 2008, Hurricane Ike hit Galveston, a massive storm, one of the costliest in American history. The seawall held again. Galveston is still there, not because the hurricane risk went away, because the people of Galveston decided they were not going to let the sea take their city. They raised the island. They built the wall. They stayed. And the engineering project they built in the years after the most devastating natural disaster in American history has now protected the city for over 100 years. That is what Galveston did. That is who the people of Galveston were. Here is what the Galveston hurricane taught me. There are 2 kinds of lessons disasters teach. The first kind is what not to do. Don't build a low-lying city without a seawall. Don't dismiss warnings because your theory says you're safe. Don't wait for someone else to solve the problem. These lessons are important. But the second kind is more interesting. What people do after. The people of Galveston in 1901 were not in a position to build a seawall and raise an island. They had just lost 1/3 of their population. Their city was half destroyed. Their economy was shattered. They were grieving and exhausted. And they still decided to do one of the most ambitious engineering projects in American history. Not because someone made them, because they wanted their city back. Because Galveston was theirs. They had built it. Their families were buried there. Their lives were there. And they were not going to let a storm take it from them permanently. The seawall of Galveston is not just a concrete wall. It is a declaration. We were here. We were hit. We are still here. If incredible stories like this are your thing, real stories finally told simply, you already know what to do.